Hello and welcome to Read Becca. I recently read a couple of historical fantasy with very strong feminist themes, and that's got me thinking about a couple others that I've read and loved that I really wanted to make a list to share with people. I feel like it's very underrated, but historical fantasy is one of my favorite aspects or niches of the fantasy genre, and specifically, as I said, I've really loved some takes on that incorporate feminist stories. So let's start with the kind of lighter options and work toward the more heavy reads on this list. The first one I want to recommend to you is Miss Percy's Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons by Quenby Olson. There is a sequel out now that I need to get to very soon. So this is a Regency set story. We're following Mildred Percy, who is 40 years old, a spinster. She is kind of looked down on for that, but she's given up her whole life basically to be the governess to her sister's children, and they all kind of walk all over her until she receives an inheritance from a family member that is kind of out of nowhere. And she receives this inheritance that everyone else seems intrigued by, and they think they might be able to profit from. But in fact, it's not a monetary inheritance. It's some papers and some odd rocks. So she's just trying to figure out what this means and enlists the local vicar, because he's kind of the source of knowledge in the area. He teaches the school, that sort of thing. And together, they of course uncover that the rocks are dragon eggs. Well, they're not finding out dragons are real, and they have just kind of not been around for a while until their egg hatches. So all of this does have a little bit of tension in that we do get a villain perspective who is obviously interested in this inheritance for his own gains, and he's pretty ominous. So there is some tense moments with this guy for sure. But what I loved about this is just that this is all about Mildred Percy's journey toward independence, toward finding her feet beneath her, and that's the feminist element here. It is so much about her bucking trends and social expectations, especially in the face of her own family underestimating her and kind of looking down on her for the fact that she served them all this time, you know? She gave up her whole life for them, and they take it for granted. So I love to see her come into her own in this story. There is also a very subtle romance to this that I appreciated. It's almost barely there. It's in secret glances, basically. So don't expect heavy romance, but it is sweet, and I loved it. And I hope there's more of it in the next book. There is also the element of how it's told, because we're not just getting the elements of everything that's happening to her through this. She also is the person who begins writing this guide to the care and feeding of British dragons, because she realizes, hey, we don't have any guide. Maybe we should start documenting what we're doing here. And that's just such a wonderful element of her character, that's a thing she thinks to do. And the characterization here throughout is just really great. There are a couple of characters you love to hate, I would say. There is annoying characteristics to one of the characters that got under my skin so badly, but that's just because it was so well written. So characterization is on point for this book. So I would say I absolutely loved this book and highly, highly recommend it. The next book that I would recommend to you is The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. And this one is very interesting because it's also literary inspired, and it's kind of a mashup of a lot of things from historical literature. So we are starting from the character of Mary Jekyll, who is the daughter of Jekyll of Jekyll and Hyde. And that's kind of the seed for this premise here, in that we have a group of daughters of these literary mad scientists, effectively. Rappaccini, Moreau, Frankenstein all show up here. And that's such an interesting premise because they all have this connection in being daughters of these fathers who, because they were mad scientists, resulted in a lot of trauma for these girls as their children. So that's explored as a heavy feminist theme here. But the major plot is twofold. So Mary Jekyll has recently lost her mother. She passed away. And that's what throws her on the course of tracing down these other women. She's trying to unravel a mystery about her mother. And so as she is pulling that thread, she begins uncovering these other women along her way. But alongside that, the second sort of plot is that Sherlock Holmes and Watson are around, and there are these murders going on in the city. And so these women start all getting caught up in solving the murders that are going on and helping out. So it is very steeped in literature, but it's also incredibly fun and entertaining. It's got that element of having a little quirk to the telling as well, just like the first book, where we actually know that one of the characters is writing this story down, and the others are occasionally interjecting with their corrections or thoughts on what the story is that's being written. So if you are not one for that, for authorial interjections and sometimes random rambling and conversations where you will get multiple characters going back and forth, this may not be one for you, because that is very heavily used through this book. But I think that is a great balance in terms of their banter. They're a great cast of women characters who have banded together to come out of some trauma and some difficult things in their pasts. And that kind of joyous fun element balances the fact that this is a very heavy story. As I already said about the traumatic histories is certainly a feminist element. The social roles in this historical setting are clearly imposed on them. Mary is really struggling because she's very limited in what she can do now that she's sort of independent as a woman. And at times she's pushed that she should just get married just so she can have financial stability. And she kind of doesn't really want that for herself. So there's an even darker element to this with the killings that are going on. Those do get kind of graphic, and the motives there are graphic as well. So I will say there's a great balance in tone between levity and compassion with these women and the heavier elements that are here. Overall, it's very entertaining to read. It feels like you could be reading a book that was written during the time. It's just very beautifully written. The next one I have is The Once and Future Witches by Alix E. Harrow. And this one is really interesting because it's set in a version of historical Salem, but it's New Salem, because anytime that women have had power, basically their power bubbles up as magic, and it's been burned away by the people who want to maintain power over those women. And so this is where we're getting into the much more difficult, less levity territory, because New Salem has crushed women's power, and there's no more women's magic in the world until a suffragettes rally in the New Salem Square basically comes together. And simply the power of women coming together results in magic resuming in the world. So it comes back and bubbles up in that way. And women realize that their power has always been there. So in this story, we're following three sisters who are very different. They have been estranged, and there is an element for one of them with abuse that feels like betrayal from the others, where they should have protected her and they didn't. They're all coming out of a lot of trauma from their childhoods. So that is another tie-in to the previous one. But they meet up at this suffragettes rally by accident and then are thrown together by it. So it's, again, you see these women who don't really know each other at this point. They haven't seen each other in years, and they come together and form a really wonderful but complicated bond, just like the previous book. So over the course of this novel, we see basically them trying to use their magical power to enact actual power for women. So that's kind of the focus here. But I love that this specific book really tackles intersectionality in terms of feminism, because we have a side character who is trans. We have a lesbian relationship in this story, so that's definitely actually a pretty prominent element in here. We also see one of the things that I love the most, is very minor, but it's such a big deal that it's pointed out here, is that the women of color in the past have built systems and structure to help them survive. And the white women here, it's made clear that they benefit from and are able to utilize that structure that's been put in place without having done the work, basically. And so I love that was actually pointed out in the book and made explicit, because that is something that comes up through time and is so taken for granted, that that women of color have done the work, and it benefits all of us in feminist circles. So yeah, I really love that was pointed out. And this book is just so good from a character perspective. It's a little slower paced, I would say, than the previous books that I listed off, and I think that's going to be the case as we go along. But yeah, definitely a great character focus and really strong world built story here for sure. The next one that I have is the Winter Night trilogy by Katherine Arden, and this is so epic in scope and stakes, not in that it's world spanning or world ending, but that it's emotionally epic, and the journey that you go on is it will grind you down a little bit. That's for sure. This one is very emotionally difficult, and I will give you massive triggers for sexual assault throughout this series as well, and abuse. Very, very big content warnings for that throughout. This one starts in Russia at kind of the point where it's changing over between this traditional folkloric belief and the Christian church is taking over and really crushing that traditional belief. And so we are following this young girl, Vasya, as she lives in kind of a very remote village, and she's kind of the leader's daughter who is really held up and under a lot of scrutiny. And when the priest comes into their village, there's a strange dynamic between them that causes a lot of problems. And that's pretty much scope of the first book, is her being pulled different ways based on the expectations of her family and the church versus what she actually wants. And behind all of that is the actual fantasy element, that she can see spirits, these traditional spirits that everyone is now neglecting because they've become more into the Christian and Catholic religion. She sees them as tangible beings. She has a house spirit that she interacts with, and she is the only one who is caring for them anymore and keeping them up, and that is integral to the stasis of her world. And so that's the big element that carries through everything. So as things go on in the story, it gets bigger and grander. Traditional folklore is the vibe through all of this. So I think that's the strong element. But through all three books, it gets incredibly harrowing. The social expectations that are put on her, betrayals by her family members who she loves, who want to force her into the role that she's set out as a woman, and a woman from her family, are very hard. In the second book specifically, she does live as a boy for a while, and that increases threat at times for her. That's the only way she can live as in the way that she wants and continue trying to do the things that she's set out to, but it's also a huge risk for her. So she's under threat for a large part of this book. So this has a really great tie-in to actual Russian history. She's not just in this rural village, she does set out and winds up in major cities with major historical events and characters. So I think it's a really immersive way. You can feel the cold of Russian winter in this book throughout. So I would say for a very harrowing one with some really compelling characters, a compelling character journey, this is definitely that book. The final book, as I'm losing my light here, is The Mermaid by Christina Henry, and she's kind of known for her retellings, for kind of tweaking things. This, I would say, is not really a Little Mermaid retelling at all. it has some of those elements, but I would not go in expecting that at all. This really is a historical set around P.T. Barnum, and our mermaid is the only fantastical element. So it is very grounded, it is very slow, and it is very heavy, but it's well worth taking on because we're following this mermaid character who, she was caught by a fisherman and he opted to let her go. And that's why she loved him and stayed with him for an entire life. And the villagers in her village have always kind of known something was different about her. They suspected, but they loved her. She was so integrated into their community and well loved by the community that they always sought to protect her. But of course, with any secret, that gets out. And so the secret has gotten out, and P.T. Barnum is coming to seek her out and try to convince her to join his carnival of oddities. And so that's the impetus. He has this too good to be true deal for her, and she feels like it would be safer for everyone if she just goes along with it, and she doesn't really have anything stopping her anymore because she's had a full life. And so what this means is her winding up in a bargain that gives up her autonomy. She's constantly overlooked. That struggle of reading her wanting to seek her own freedom and independence, and she's always been extremely independent through her life because everyone treated her as loved and different and never tried to force her into a social role. But here she is in cities and out in the grander world, and everyone is expecting her to not be this wild creature. So one of the most challenging, I would say emotionally difficult moments to this is really her interactions with Barnum's wife, who doesn't seem to even realize the possibility that she herself could have autonomy. She has so ingrained sexism through society that she thinks that herself, her daughter, they don't have full autonomy because they're women. So she just kind of assumes and imposes those ideas on the mermaid because she doesn't think there is any other option. And the mermaid definitely kind of opens her eyes to that not being the reality, that being a box that she's put in by society. So I think that's the key feminist element that's explored here is really how limiting that is and how difficult the situation she's put into because of this is, because there's a literal translation here of her being trapped by the social role of womanhood and her being trapped quite literally in like an aquarium as this mermaid. And so she's very shackled by it. And I think it is a hopeful story overall, but it's pretty grim getting there if you struggle with those sort of sexist themes. So overall, I think that is all of my feminist historical fantasy that I would recommend to you. Give me a list down below if you have any other good ideas. I know there are a lot of mythological retellings, but I wouldn't consider those quite historical fantasy. So yeah, that's it for me today. Thank you so very much for watching.